Welcome back to another Canadian Business History Talk. Today we're joined by Allan Levine, the award-winning author of 16 history books, including Toronto, Biography of City, and King, William Lyon Mackenzie King, A Life Guided by the Hand of Destiny. Interviewing Allan today will be Canadian Business History Association Executive Director, Stephen Bright. Stephen?
Hi, Allan. Thank you very much for joining us. Your book is fantastic and it's extremely timely. And of course, I happen to have a copy here. $1 a Year Men: How the Best Business Brains in Canada Helped to Win the Second World War. So for the sake of our listeners and viewers and members and general public, maybe I could just set the scene a little bit by a definition. Who or what or who were the $1 a Year Men?
Right. When Canada declared war on Germany in September 1939, there had already been a movement, even before the war, to involve professional, accountants, lawyers, business people in the development of Canada's wartime economy. I mean, I don't think William Lyon Mackenzie King, the Prime Minister, and J.L. Ralston, Leighton Ralston, who was the finance minister at that point, later became the defense minister, and then later got into a big argument about King with conscription that's famous. They trusted businessmen they didn't quite, the process was gradual in a sense, but I think they felt that business people would keep war profiteering out of it and keep things honest and make sure, just as a note, I mentioned the Bren gun controversy. That was actually the thing that triggered one of the recommendations about that, because the contract for these machine guns had been given without tender. It was to have some kind of board of business people involved. The civil service was very small, and they would have had to have been retrained. I think that I would just make, without going on too much, but the point was, in September 1939, Canada had no really wartime industry. They didn't really know what the British were going to need, how bad the war would get, or anything like that. But Canada had a limited aviation industry. The last ship probably had been built in 1921. The country had never built a tank, other than the Bren gun. They had never built a proper machine gun, like a more high-tech one, and at least for those years. And they were starting from scratch almost. And you had King and Ralston not wanting to spend a lot of money, which of course So that's sort of where the thing came from.
So speaking of money, were they literally paid $1 a year, or where's the name itself come from?
Yes, I know that took me a while to actually get to the bottom of this. The name itself, though, had an origins in the United States during the First World War, when the U.S. was in the First World War for about 18 months, and then 1917-18. They had business people, and that they were called $1 a year, meant to symbolize their volunteer service. Okay. I don't know whether, in fact, they were paid $1 a year. And then in World War II, the same thing. So when Canada started appointing these businessmen, the name sort of stuck, and it was used throughout the war. After much digging, I came across a report from 1949 in which the whole process was, first of all, the numbers astounded me, because I was dealing the book deals mainly with the people that were involved with C.D. Howe in the Department of Munitions Supply, but there were hundreds of people, Wartime Prices and Trade Board, Defense Ministry. So then probably about 800 of these people, lawyers, accountants. And in the Munitions and Supply, which was I thought got the most attention and is the focus of my book, there were probably about 260 people. Out of those 260, one guy actually got paid $1. Most of them, some of them were there for 3 or 4 years. I don't think they understood when they volunteered that would be that long. They weren't sure, of course, but they needed to be paid. Their firms more or less covered their salaries, which was an act of patriotism too, because they were gone and subordinates had to take it over, and their businesses suffered to a certain extent, probably. And their expenses were covered. So a lot of them, the Chateau Laurier Hotel in Ottawa became sort of a hub for a while. And so they covered the expenses, weren't a ton, but the opposition and complained about it. And whether or not, again, I asked the question, could the civil service have done this? And Howe certainly didn't think so when he became involved, and it would have taken to train all these people. So they wanted people with management skills that could take on, like, how do you create an aviation industry quickly?
Exactly.
Yeah, and that's what the book's about.
Well, I want to dive into the book in a second, but can you just kind of step back a little bit? As an author, you've written many, many books. I've read many of them. Your Toronto book I thought was fantastic. What was your motivation in writing what turned out to be an extremely timely book, which we'll get to in a second? What drew you to the topic?
Right. I wish I could say it was entirely my idea, but that's not the truth. The truth was that I was contacted by Sarah Scott of Barlow Books, the publisher of the book. Her grandfather was Douglas Ambridge, who was at one time president of Abitibi Pulp and Paper. Okay. He was a prominent dollar a year man, and he's featured in the book, and he was involved in many big projects. Mm-hmm. So it was her, actually, to be honest. It was her idea, really. I have to admit that I did not, even though I've written about World War II and wrote a book about Mackenzie King, I did not know a lot about. I didn't really think about, to be honest, Howe Canada's wartime industry. I mean, I had read books by Michael Bliss about Howe, and I'd read biography as a grad student years earlier, but it never really clicked in my brain. And I certainly didn't know the how many people were involved and the thing. So, and there's not a lot. The other thing is that it's rare to find a topic in World War II history that has not been really given a big treatment. I mean, there's stuff in academic books about this. Yeah. And in biographies of some of the more prominent ones, like E.P. Taylor's biography written years ago. I mean, his wartime service, and some of these guys left memoirs, but they're very obscure. You would not have found them. Like the best, I would say, one of the best sources among other archival sources I had was Henry Borden, who was a very notable guy, who's the nephew of Sir Robert Borden.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, fascinating.
Interpreter in Toronto, and his firm still exists. I think it's called Borden, Ladner, Gervais or something along those lines. It's a big firm still. And he left an unpublished memoir that I came across, and it's in his papers in Ottawa at the National Library and Archives. And he didn't let anybody really read the memoir. It was really meant for his family, but although I do know that one historian in the 70s or 80s rather read a little bit of it. He died in 1989. Okay. So that he gives a really good personal account of how the process worked and how they worked with Howe and the personalities of some of the key players. So I have to say I made good use of that.
Well, I was actually going to ask you, you've mentioned it already. I've been in the archives myself as a historian. What was there a surprise find that something that you just looked at it, uncovered a box and found something, or what? Were there any surprises in your research?
You can, as you know, Munitions and Supply during World War II produced amazing amount of paper. Reports committed. A lot of it I had to wade through. They have, they created 28 Crown corporations to either manage or actually run of businesses, and each of those had massive amounts. I actually have to say that one of the things that guided my research, I found a 2013 master's thesis at the University of Calgary by a guy named Jeremy Stewart, and he was very helpful. I ended up talking to him, and he was looking for different things, but he had spent some time in those archives, so he guided my research a bit, and I knew what I was looking for. And some of the stuff, there's some good correspondence there, especially over an event dealing with an aluminum factory in Arvida, Quebec, when Howe wanted to call in the army because the workers were striking, and and this is in 1941, aluminum, of course, was needed in almost every munition industry. And Howe thought that foreign agitators were behind the strike. They weren't. I mean, he just frankly flipped out a bit, in my view. And then when the army, of course, when they told the General Creer or the head of the army that he wasn't going to go into this factory and attack the workers, he said, "I'm not doing that." And Howe got into a bit of a tizzy and went to hide himself golf club that he had a room in Ottawa, and then threatened to quit the cabinet, and that threw Mackenzie King into a bit of a kerfuffle because he obviously didn't want to lose Howe, whether Howe was serious or not. But anyways, him and the cabinet appeased Howe sufficiently over that. But then those are the kinds of things that happen. And, Howe is central to the story, of course, because he was, I compare him to sort of like a snowplow parent, moving these obstacles out of the way so these guys can do what they have to do.
Well, it's funny, yeah, because a lot of people watching this video will be familiar with C.D. Howe for lots of reasons, not least of which is the C.D. Howe Institute, or he's just kind of a name. And I've studied the war extensively, so I've come across him. But a name I had not seen, and which I particularly liked in your book, was Wallace Campbell, president of Ford Canada.
Right.
And I happen to be living in Oakville. Ford is a big employer here, obviously, but I'd never heard of Wallace Campbell, who then, I believe, please correct me, but was the first chair of the War Supply Board.
Right.
And it seemed that Campbell had a colorful, I don't know how to describe it, in terms of his relationship with the government. So can you tease out a little bit more? Can you introduce us a bit more to Wallace Campbell?
Well, okay. So I think the other thing that's important to keep in mind and throughout this whole thing is that in September 39, they declared the War Measures Act. This gave the King government essentially dictatorial powers. So this was government by order in council. It allowed the government to censor the press and turn the Japanese and turn other people. And it also allowed them to expropriate companies easily. And so the dollar a year men were involved so they were working in this moment of time in which Howe, when he became the head of the department in 1940, when they created the Department of Munitions Supply, he had a lot of power, power that frankly his cabinet colleagues through 1940-41 were very concerned about and challenged it. But he was determined, this is what we're going to do. But Wallace Campbell it's true, he was one of the first people recruited. He was the president of Ford Canada and had known Henry Ford and so forth. But he was very imperious in personality. He just really had operated in a hierarchy that was really top down. He didn't play well with others. Let's put it that way. He comes in and he tells Ralston, "I want $100 million." Ralston's looking at him like he's crazy. "I'm not giving you $100 million. He didn't want to be. He was extremely inflexible. Not only that, he alienated Henry Borden, as well as a guy named Gordon Scott, who later tragically dies, one of the only dollar a year men that dies. We can talk about that. But, Scott actually quit for a while when he was a financial advisor and an accountant from Montreal. But he told Borden that in Christmas of December 39, "I'm leaving. I'm not going to be treated like this anymore." I mean, Campbell sort of treated him like his private secretary. And the guy's a professional accountant, 50 years old. And he left, and he didn't actually come back. And so Campbell just alienated a lot of people. He talked to journalists they shouldn't have, and that kind of stuff got into the press. As you know, the Financial Post, especially during 1939, 40 into 41, the Financial Post and the Globe and Mail were very harsh critics of the government. They didn't think the government was working fast enough, doing enough. They questioned some of the choices of dollar a year men, and Howe, of course, could not put up with any criticism. He, at one point he calls the Financial Post the #1 saboteur in Canada. And Wallace Campbell was talking to these guys, and that stuff was getting into the paper. So Campbell made it an enemy. By the time Howe comes along, Ralston's initially in charge of the War Supply Board. Then the responsibility is given to Howe. King basically tells Howe, do what you want with Campbell. Because Borden, losing Borden would have been bad. And how eventually they figure out a way, to get rid of him. He just was not, it's not like you had to deal with the same kind of regulatory bodies that you deal with now, but he was just not a good team player and couldn't operate within this system. So there was a lot of controversy because he was such a big guy in business.
Sure.
When he's sort of asked to leave, or whatever the story they put out was, there's negative comments in the Globe and other, how could we be losing such an important person and so forth. So that's what happened to him. It wasn't a lot of people like that. Some of these guys didn't work out, and they were sort of sent packing or reassigned. One guy had a nervous breakdown because from all the stress, he was reassigned too.
You talked about the system, within, and I want to tease out a little bit, what the system was, what it kind of looked like, how it worked. And there's an expression referred to as the mandarins, these senior bureaucrats who are running big parts of the war, who had known King for many, many years. They worked together. They often lived together in certain neighborhoods. They socialized together, a pretty tightly knit group. And then come in, the $1 a year men. So can you talk about a little bit, how did, either in the aggregate or specifically, how did the, kind of the mandarins, as it were, who are the core around Mackenzie King, the bureaucrats running big parts of the war, how did the mandarins work with the $1 a year men? And did the mandarins learn anything from business leaders? And did the business leaders learn anything from the mandarins?
I would say they did not get along well in some cases. There certainly was some antagonism in terms of who's in charge. Like Borden, who was the corporate lawyer, but the Justice Department under LaPointe wanted to do stuff, and there were people under him. The Wartime Prices and Trades Board, if I got that right, there was some conflict between Howe's department and some of those. Graham Towers, is that his name? I think, was head of the bank.
Yeah.
He was involved, and there was the Howe ended up having an executive committee of some of the top for about 8-9 months to get this sort of organized. Borden was one of them, E.P. Taylor, Gordon Scott, and so forth. And they created production agencies, like 17 production agencies. So there would be an aviation, munitions, shipbuilding, small guns, and et cetera, all sorts of things that were needed for war, tanks, and so forth. And then these three guys, R.A.C. Henry, I should mention, Robert A.C. Henry is another important person in this story. He was a $1 a year man from Montreal with a bit of a scandalous past, because he had been involved as a public servant and then a private businessman in the Beauharnais hydroelectric power scandal. I don't know if in the early 30s there was it humiliated the Liberal Party, and it's a long complicated story but to suffice to say, people were giving money to the Liberal government and then making it would seem like an exchange for approval of this massive hydroelectric power project. Henry was involved to a certain extent in that, and then he worked for the company that took over Beauharnais. By the time the 30s come, he's too brilliant a guy. He's an engineer and brilliant manager. He's brought in, and he stays in Ottawa for quite some time. And later, actually, I think was Howe's deputy minister in the Minister of Reconstruction after the war. So Henry Borden and Gordon Scott decided that Crown corporations were the way to go to, and as I said, there ended up being 28 of them. They did it very discreetly. They planned this thing. They didn't want to run on some of the products, so they created a Federal Aircraft to help with the aircraft production industry. That was under a guy named Ralph Bell, who's another good character. He was the director. They appointed these guys called Director General. So Bell was given the job of running the aviation industry and did a remarkable job under the circumstances. He was an amateur pilot from Halifax, a fisheries executive who was kind of he had a nasty temper, also a little inflexible. Howe went to him in June 1940 and said, I want you to come and run the aviation production branch. And, Bell said to him, well, I can fly a plane. I really don't know how to build them. And, Howe barked at him and said, no, you're going to do this. And he did. And he did an amazing job. So they created this Federal Aircraft Crown Corporation that Bell was actually in charge of for a couple months. But then he realized that he needed to, he couldn't do both. The Federal Aircraft was based in Montreal. It was sort of like a management company that would help create, get factories, the contracts to build the planes. And so without Howe, this is sort of characteristic. So Howe usually consulted with the $1 a year man, but in this case, he just decided to appoint a guy named Ray Lawton, who was later the Lieutenant Governor of Ontario. He was a printing business, and that ended up being a bad thing. Lawton and Ralph Bell really didn't like each other, and they thought each of the others was in charge, and there's a lot of fighting, and Howe had egos, and Howe had to deal with that. So that was, but so that's, and then they also had to set up So there was the Crown Corporations, the production branches, and then they also set up 17 controllers early on. They timber, steel, and one other one, rubber maybe, was one of the other early ones. And then eventually there were 17 to make sure that the resources that were needed for the war were so controlled. So consumers in Canada couldn't buy tires and rubber toilet seats and beach balls and so forth. And, rubber was a huge story in the war. I mean, I learned much about, especially because the Japanese got control of the natural rubber supply and they weren't sharing. And then when the Americans came in, they didn't want to share either. So this led to one of the biggest Crown corporations developed and very highly successful. It was called Polymer in Sarnia, which was a synthetic rubber factory, but not a factory. It was like a city that they built, a massive $50 million project during the war. And Sarah Scott's, the publisher of Bartlett Books, her grandfather, Douglas Ambridge, was one of the people in charge of that. Yeah. I mean, he's a pulp and paper guy, and yet he took over this massive project. It was one of the few things I remember. I read that Howe said it kept him up at night, and was the only project that it was. I mean, it would have been billions and billions of dollars today, but it was highly successful. And by the end of the war, most of the products Canadians were using were used by Polymer, was the synthetic rubber that they created. And that company lasted into the 1980s, unlike many of the Crown corporations were dissolved. So that's sort of how the process worked. Now in the if you just I'll just give you one more story here, but in 1940, when Howe was forced to go to Britain, which leads to this horrendous story and tragedy of Gordon Scott's death, there is sort of a movement. A lot of people are questioning his decisions. Things aren't being built fast enough. The planes aren't coming off the factory floor fast enough. Well, can you just imagine how hard that must have been? And Canada was involved, as you know, in the British Commonwealth Air Training Program. It was a massive undertaking. They needed runways and places for the soldiers to live and the trainers, building these training planes that were necessary to train the pilots. And the British, surprisingly enough, were difficult to deal with. They actually, even though Nazis had taken over Western Europe and they were raining bombs down on London, these guys in Britain were like, they didn't want Canada to compete with them in an aviation industry. And so they were protective of their American suppliers and all sorts of crazy things like this. But so during this period of time, Howe was, he was away for a while, a couple months. And there were people like within the War Trade Board and other people that decided that there should be some control on what Howe was doing. And this was the most probably antagonistic issue that came up. They wanted to create something called the Wartime Requirements Board. And they recruited one of the Howe's $1-a-year men, a guy named Harvey McMillan from BC, a brilliant businessman, came from nothing. He's the McMillan and McMillan Bloedel, the huge lumber company. A huge legacy. He was a brilliant guy. Came to Ottawa. He agreed to be the timber controller. He was controlling his competitors' businesses, which is kind of interesting too. But he there's a sense of urgency about all these people. There's a desperation that we probably can't quite understand. They were very loyal to Britain, as to be a good Canadian or English Canadian meant you did everything you could to save Britain. That was their prime motivation. Some probably had children, sons in the army and wanted to help them. And McMillan got caught up in this sort of like challenging Howe, and he joined with these guys in that wanted this Wartime Requirements Board. Mackenzie King, strangely enough, let it go on probably too long. And then when Howe came back from London, he had to deal with it. McMillan ended up sort of being like a deer in the headlights, challenging Howe publicly and privately and giving bad interviews. And eventually ends up, Howe wanted to just fire him outright, but listened to some people and sent him packing to Montreal to look after a merchant shipping Crown Corporation. But that's a good story. That's a good story also. It just shows you how Howe worked. He didn't publicly embarrass McMillan. And at the end of the war, McMillan threw a banquet for Howe, saying what a great guy he was.
Yeah.
And, that was sort of. Henry Borden came in and sort of eased the tension, but the Wartime Requirements Board never became really nothing. It was sort of just it was an advisory group, but Howe didn't really pay much attention to them, and he did what he wanted to do, and there was nothing really much the cabinet could do. I have to say, one of the things that did surprise me in this story, and I never really thought about it when I was writing about King, was I can't think of another Canadian prime minister that ceded so much authority to a cabinet minister as King did to Howe. I mean, King was, as you know, an insecure person, one of the things about him, among others, but he trusted Howe's instincts and did everything he could do to keep him happy. But he did, he let Howe have a lot of leeway and run this thing the way he did. And no one else in that cabinet could have done what he did.
Yeah, no, and I do want to reflect on that a little bit in a 2025 context for some obvious reasons. But before we get there, before we kind of come to the present, $1 a year men, as the father of 2 daughters, I was wondering, were women involved at all? Were they recruited? Maybe not under the $1 a year category, but did the war effort bring in women to help fight the war? From a government perspective,
right? I mean, women certainly have worked in factories. Like more than that part. I mean, John Turner's mother, Phyllis, was, I think she was an economist. She was involved in the war. And there was one other woman whose name escapes me. In 1946, when I mentioned this book by a writer named Coralyn Cox, who it's called something Canadian Strength. And they use Karsh photos that I have in the book. Of course. And there was 46 people profiled in this book, with laudatory little bios. 2 of them were women. That's out of the 46. I have to say it was a man's world. Women were not, and not only a man's world, but there's no diversity really here. These were white, English-speaking people, mainly, not even French Canadian, hardly any French Canadians. The world of 1940 is not today. I have since learned there were a few, there's a couple of people that weren't, Catholic or Jewish or something, but they were on lower level. They weren't involved in a big way. It's kind of funny. I just had, since the book's been written, I've been getting emails from the grandchildren of some of these people. Why isn't my grandfather?
Oh, okay, yeah. Well,
and some of them, I try to explain. I'm dealing with, there were 800 people. I'm dealing with hundreds of people. It's very hard to include. And you have to focus. I'm focusing on some of the people that were the key decision makers, and of course, there's no other way really to tell this story. But it's funny how people are they've heard all their lives about their grandfathers being $1 a year men, and how they assumed they of course would find their name in the index. And
exactly.
It's not there.
Well, as you say, you can't touch on everyone. In closing, why don't we kind of come to the present as you're talking about? We're 2025. Prime Minister Mark Carney says he intends to ramp up the Canadian defense industry in the biggest way since your book.
Yes.
So do you think Prime Minister Carney or leaders today can learn from what happened, the $1 a year men, and then more broadly, I'd love your thoughts on what's the value of business history for leaders today, whether it be World War II history or just broadly speaking?
I mean, I have been, as you can well imagine, I have been asked this question many times.
Yeah.
I mean, I think I'm 2 minds of it. One, World War II was a moment in time that is difficult to really. It's not. You can't recreate this. Yeah. I mean, the desperation, the urgency, the sort of willingness to spend money. How really, I'll just read you. Howe's one of my favorite lines from Howe, and I use it in the book, is this is him. I'm 1940. He says, "Before the war is over, everything will be needed. So let's go ahead anyway. If we lose the war, nothing will matter. If we win the war, the cost will still have been of no consequence and will have been forgotten." That you just wouldn't have someone saying that kind of thing today. So, and they were operating, as I said, within an orders and council. War Measures Act government, which allowed these people to do what they needed to do. So that in itself, they couldn't operate in the same way. And I really, I can't imagine, and I do know about some of the issues, and the Globe and Mail had a big article about defense production last week, I think it was, or 2 weeks ago. You can't imagine CEOs or vice presidents just deserting their companies and coming to Ottawa and saying, "See you, I'll be around, for 3 years," and they're being paid. The world's just more complicated. Plus, the civil service is massive compared to what it was back then, as I said. And there's all these regulations and committees and meetings, and so the world is really different. But I have noted the creation of this Defense Procurement Agency under someone's noted that it's under a Secretary of State as opposed to a cabinet position. So, but they did hire this guy from RBC, Doug Guzman, at a large salary. He's working full time. Or Dawn Farrell, in charge of major projects and out of Calgary, she's looking after all these massive projects at Carney. I mean, he's certainly business oriented, and there's a role for business, but they also, I think, want to involve 50 business people on some builders exchange program that I could, that makes sense. And so clearly business leadership and skills are necessary, and it's just done today differently, in my view. It's not history doesn't quite repeat itself in this case, but even after the war, Howe kept relying on business people. The last so-called $1 a year man, in fact, I traced to about 1954. He kept recruiting people, and when the Korean War, when Canada was involved, he also got some guys back. A person who had been involved in the invention of something called RDX, which was a massive explosive that they used. But James Ritchie Donald, he was called back from Montreal and couldn't really say no to Howe. So I think that all of these things are positive in a way, but it's a different world, and I wish I could say that it's completely transferable, but there's a lot of factors that don't, and you don't have anybody in the cabinet like Howe. There's no Howe today, and there hasn't been since he's been out of it, really. I mean, Carney is it, but he's got business people in his office, and I think his clerk of the Privy Council is a businessman. His chief of staff is also a businessman. Yeah, so there's clearly a business orientation that we haven't seen since the war in Mulrooney years, so I think that's something.
Well, listen, I want to thank you very much for your book. Again, $1 a Year Men by Barlow Books. And I want to thank Sarah for setting this up with us. Any last thoughts, Allan?
Well, yeah, you asked me, what about business history? I mean, clearly, it's an important aspect of Canadian society, and that these guys were sort of forgotten, really. Many of them were rather humble. And their story, I think, gets lost in the national narrative that's concerned more with politics and other issues like conscription during World War II. So I think their service to me was the most important thing. They didn't have to do this; they chose to. So they were really dedicated to the country and the people, and that should be something I think we should honor. And it's really an interesting group of people, and they did really help Canada win the war.
Yeah, no, I think that there's no question, and your book really illuminates a lot of that stuff. And as we say at CBHA, the history can inform the future in the sense of business history is interesting stories, but it can also inform strategy for those who are interested in that kind of thing. So your book is extremely timely, and thank you very much for your time today.
Thanks a lot for having me.
Stephen and Allan, thank you both so much for your time and presence in this video. And if you, listener, enjoyed this video, please be sure to give it a like and share it with someone else that you think might enjoy it too. Be sure to subscribe to the channel so that you're notified whenever we post a new video. And if you're interested in becoming a member of the Canadian Business History Association, visit our website, cbha.ca, where you can find more information. And on behalf of the entire Canadian Business History Association, thank you so much for tuning in to this Canadian Business History Talk. And we'll see you in the next one.